The moment I stepped onto my front yard that morning, I knew I was in trouble. My perfectly trimmed hedge, the pride of my garden and the centerpiece of my property, was mangled. Branches were broken, leaves strewn across the driveway, and dirt kicked up around the base. My heart sank as I spotted tire marks cutting straight through the soft grass, a clear sign that HOA Karen had struck again. She had a habit of driving over my property whenever she thought she had the right to do so, ignoring boundaries, etiquette, and common decency. I clenched my fists, pacing along the edge of the hedge. I had warned her countless times, politely, firmly, and with photographic evidence, that her reckless driving was destroying my property. HOA meetings, polite letters, and even community mediation had yielded nothing. Karen thrived on control, entitlement, and chaos, treating the neighborhood like her personal playground. Each time her car crushed another section of my hedge, my frustration grew, but today was different. Today, patience had run out. I began planning a response that would be clever, safe, and completely justified. This wasn't about revenge for its own sake, it was about protecting my property and sending a clear message that reckless entitlement comes with consequences. I sketched ideas, measured distances, and considered what type of trap could immobilize her vehicle without causing harm to anyone. Safety and legality were paramount. I didn't want an accident, I wanted a lesson, a firm, undeniable lesson. Over the next few days, I sourced materials, sturdy timber, reinforced steel, and high-traction components that could support weight but collapse strategically. I studied her schedule, noting when she typically drove past my hedge. Timing was everything. The trap had to be precise, effective, and inescapable. While some neighbors whispered about petty revenge, I treated this like an engineering project, documenting every step, ensuring it was foolproof. Finally, the morning came. The hedge stood taller and prouder than ever, flanked by my hidden creation. Karen's car rumbled down the street, oblivious to what awaited. My heart raced, a mix of adrenaline, anticipation, and satisfaction. The trap wasn't just about stopping her, it was about reclaiming control, respecting boundaries, and proving that reckless behavior would have consequences. As she approached, the wheels rolled onto my hidden mechanism. The trap engaged perfectly, sinking just enough to immobilize the car without damage to anyone nearby. I watched, satisfied, knowing Karen would finally understand the price of ignoring rules, boundaries, and respect. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. How she reacted, the HOA's response, and the aftermath would escalate in ways nobody expected. Karen slammed on the brakes as her car lurched to a stop, wheels caught in the hidden trap. She leaned forward, squinting at the hedge, her mouth opening in disbelief. What is this?" she screamed, trying to rock the car free, but the mechanism held perfectly. Her anger turned into panic as she realized this wasn't an accident, it was a deliberate, perfectly executed response to her repeated violations. I stepped out of the house, arms crossed, wearing a calm expression that only fueled her fury. "Good morning, Karen," I said smoothly. "Notice anything different about the hedge?" Her eyes widened, scanning the yard, then falling back to her trapped vehicle. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by confusion, frustration, and mounting dread. She stomped toward the trap, shaking her fists. "You can't do this. This is harassment." I shook my head, suppressing a smile. "This is protection. You've driven over my hedge more times than I can count. Every warning, every polite request, ignored. Today, I enforced boundaries. Safely. Legally. Creatively." Karen flailed, pacing around the car, muttering about calling the HOA, police, and even lawyers. None of her threats held weight, yet she didn't understand that the trap was fully documented, safe, and fully within my rights. From a distance, some neighbors had begun to gather, curious about the commotion. Whispers spread, Karen had driven over the hedge again, and now her car was immobilized. A few exchanged glances, clearly enjoying the reversal of power. Karen, however, didn't notice. She was consumed by rage, pacing and gesturing like a storm about to break. I stayed calm, letting her self-destruct while maintaining control of the narrative. I walked closer to the trap, carefully inspecting it and demonstrating to the HOA board members who had arrived that it was safe and legal. The mechanics were simple but effective: a reinforced platform designed to hold weight, triggered only by her vehicle, anchored so it couldn't damage the car or anyone nearby. Karen's protests grew louder, but each HOA member shook their heads, realizing she had pushed this too far. By now, her face was red, eyes wide, voice shrill. The neighborhood had witnessed the consequences of her repeated violations. The car remained firmly trapped. I knew this would be a turning point not just for her, but for the HOA itself. Entitlement without accountability ends abruptly when boundaries are enforced creatively and safely. Karen's fury was palpable, but she had no recourse yet. I had taken every precaution, documented every step, and ensured that the next moves were entirely under my control. Karen pounded on the hood of her car, screaming at anyone who would listen. "This is illegal. You can't do this." Her voice echoed across the street, drawing more neighbors to the scene. Children peeked from windows, and a few HOA members cautiously approached, whispering amongst themselves. Karen's entitlement had made her blind, but now everyone could see the consequences of her reckless behavior. I remained calm, standing beside the hedge, arms crossed. "Karen, every action has consequences," I said firmly. "You've ignored repeated warnings about driving over my hedge. Today, the result is this trap designed safely, legally, and effectively." Her expression shifted from fury to shock as she realized this wasn't a simple prank, it was a calculated response to repeated violations. Karen attempted to call the HOA president, frantically tapping on her phone. The HOA board members stepped closer, exchanging uneasy glances. They had supported Karen in minor disputes before, but now they saw firsthand the escalation she had caused. Their faces betrayed a mix of fear and amusement. Some whispered quietly, acknowledging that Karen had finally gone too far. I walked around the trap, demonstrating its design to the gathering neighbors and HOA members. The reinforced platform sank just enough to hold the car in place but would not harm the vehicle or anyone nearby. It was clever, effective, and completely safe, yet it sent a crystal clear message: boundaries are non-negotiable. Karen's attempts to intimidate or manipulate anyone were now irrelevant. As Karen continued shouting, I calmly approached, holding out a small notebook with my documentation. "Every warning, every photograph, every notice, all recorded," I said. Her mouth opened, searching for words, but none carried authority. The trap was the physical manifestation of accountability, and she had no way to counter it. The neighbors watched silently, fascinated by the spectacle. The story spread quickly: HOA Karen, who had terrorized the street with her reckless driving, now trapped by her own disregard for boundaries. The irony was not lost on anyone, and whispers of admiration for the clever trap spread alongside murmurs of caution to others who might try similar antics. Finally, Karen, breathless and exhausted from her frantic efforts, slumped against the car. The realization sank in: she was powerless. The trap was legal, safe, and fully documented. She had underestimated the homeowner's resolve, creativity, and commitment to protecting their property. For the first time, Karen felt the full weight of accountability. The tension hung in the air like a storm that had just passed. The HOA members had witnessed a lesson in consequences. The trap wasn't about revenge, it was about justice, safety, and respect. Karen's meltdown had only reinforced the message. Karen's face flushed a deep red as she slumped against her car, fuming but unable to escape the trap. Her hands shook as she tried to restart the engine, rocking the vehicle back and forth. Nothing worked. The trap held perfectly. This wasn't an accident, it was the result of careful planning, patience, and precision. I had anticipated every move, every frantic attempt, and each had failed spectacularly. The HOA board members gathered around cautiously, whispering amongst themselves. They were finally seeing what I had warned them about: Karen's reckless disregard for property boundaries and community rules. Some avoided her gaze entirely, clearly ashamed for supporting her previous antics. The neighbors who had come to watch exchanged nods, impressed by the ingenuity of the trap. The message was unmistakable: crossing the line carries consequences. I stepped forward, walking slowly along the hedge to demonstrate that it had been restored to perfect condition. Every branch trimmed, every leaf in place, a testament to care, patience, and respect for property. I gestured toward the trap and explained its design: a reinforced platform, pressure sensitive, safe for vehicles and people, yet completely immobilizing. This is the result of repeated disregard, I said calmly. It's not about revenge, it's about accountability. Karen screamed again, this time louder, pounding on the hood of her car. You can't do this. This is harassment, she shouted, her voice cracking. I shook my head, suppressing a grin. Karen, this isn't harassment. This is protection. You've driven over my hedge countless times. Every warning ignored. Every polite request disregarded. This is the consequence. The neighbors' murmurs grew louder. Some whispered encouragement, others laughed quietly at the irony. Karen's power over the street had crumbled in moments. Her ego and entitlement had driven her into a trap she couldn't escape. The HOA board now realized that supporting her reckless behavior could lead to serious repercussions. I handed a notebook of documentation to one of the board members, showing photos, warning notices, and maintenance records of the hedge. Every detail was accounted for. Karen's shouting grew frantic, but the evidence was undeniable. The trap had been legal, safe, and fully justified. There was no argument strong enough to overturn it. By the end of the confrontation, Karen stood defeated, muttering threats that nobody listened to. Her arrogance had been checked, the HOA's blind support had been exposed, and the neighborhood finally understood the importance of respecting boundaries. For the first time, Karen had been confronted with the consequences of her actions. The hedge was safe, the trap effective, and the lesson clear: entitlement ends where accountability begins. Today, control had been reclaimed, and respect restored. The morning after the trap had successfully immobilized Karen's car, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Children pointed excitedly from windows, neighbors exchanged knowing smiles, and even the HOA members who had once supported her reckless behavior now looked uneasy. Karen, still fuming, parked her car on the street, glaring at the hedge as if it were a personal enemy. But she dared not drive over it again. The trap had worked. I walked along the hedge, inspecting it carefully. Every branch was intact, every leaf pristine. The hedge had survived unscathed, but the message it now carried was unmistakable. This wasn't merely about landscaping, it was about boundaries, respect, and consequences. The neighbors, watching from a distance, seemed to understand instinctively: there's a line, and Karen had crossed it one too many times. The HOA board convened shortly after, clearly shaken. They approached me cautiously, murmuring questions about legality and precedent. We didn't know this could happen," one muttered. I nodded. It's simple: when repeated violations occur and warnings are ignored, there must be consequences. This was executed safely, legally, and effectively. It's a reminder that entitlement cannot override responsibility. Karen, meanwhile, stomped around her trapped vehicle, making frantic phone calls and sending furious texts. Her desperation was palpable, and the neighborhood could see it. Every attempt she made to regain control failed. She wasn't just losing a physical battle, she was losing face, authority, and credibility. Her ego, built on intimidation and manipulation, was crumbling before the community's eyes. I allowed her a few moments to vent, knowing that any attempt to escalate would only strengthen my position. Then I approached the car and calmly explained the steps required to release it safely. The trap could be disengaged easily once she acknowledged responsibility for her repeated violations and agreed to maintain proper boundaries in the future. Karen's face twisted into disbelief and anger. "I can't believe this," she shouted. By midday, the trap was dismantled safely under my supervision, and the car was free. Karen's humiliation was complete, but the lesson had been delivered. The HOA board members, now fully aware of the dangers of blind loyalty to her, nodded in quiet acknowledgement. The neighborhood had witnessed accountability in action, and I could sense a shift in attitude. The hedge stood tall and undisturbed, a silent symbol of order restored. Karen had learned that entitlement ends where consequences begin, and the HOA had learned to respect property boundaries. Today had been more than a small victory, it was a clear warning: reckless behavior carries real-world repercussions. After the trap incident, the neighborhood felt unusually quiet. Karen had retreated to her house, muttering complaints under her breath, while the HOA members avoided any confrontation. I walked along the hedge again, running my hands over the leaves and branches, making sure everything was perfect. The hedge wasn't just a boundary, it was now a symbol of authority and accountability. The trap had worked flawlessly, but the aftermath required careful management. I documented every step: photos of the immobilized car, video of the trap mechanism, and notes on Karen's repeated violations. This wasn't just about satisfying my own sense of justice, it was about protecting my property and setting a clear precedent. If this ever escalated legally, I wanted everything fully documented, leaving no room for doubt. As the HOA board observed from a distance, I calmly explained the importance of respecting neighbors' property. "Karen's behavior has caused damage and tension," I said, pointing to the hedge and the area where the trap had been. "Ignoring warnings only escalates conflicts. Boundaries are not optional, they are the foundation of a functional community." Their nods were hesitant but genuine, a sign that they finally understood the stakes. Karen eventually emerged, furious but careful not to cross the hedge again. Her vehicle remained parked on the street, and she was visibly wary. I approached her calmly, explaining that any further violations would have consequences, potentially more severe than before. Her usual bluster had lost all power: the neighborhood had witnessed the trap, the immobilized car, and her humiliation firsthand. There was no denying the effectiveness of the lesson. Over the next few days, I focused on reinforcing the hedge's strength and visibility. Stakes, additional branches, and a few hidden sensors ensured it remained a clear boundary while maintaining safety. Neighbors passed by, smiling or nodding in acknowledgement. Even children who had watched the drama unfold seemed to understand the principle: respect others' property, or face tangible consequences. Karen tried small acts of intimidation afterward, peeking over the fence, making passive-aggressive comments, but I ignored them. Her attempts to reclaim authority were futile: the trap had shifted the power dynamic. The HOA board no longer intervened on her behalf, recognizing that her reckless behavior had created the problem. By the end of the week, calm returned. The hedge stood tall, the neighborhood understood the importance of boundaries, and Karen's ego had been thoroughly humbled. Today wasn't just a victory for me, it was a lesson for everyone who had underestimated the consequences of entitlement. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Yet, the memory of the trap incident lingered like an unspoken warning. Karen avoided my property entirely, her arrogance replaced by cautious calculation. Every glance she gave toward the hedge was filled with hesitation, a silent acknowledgement of the consequences she had faced. The HOA members, too, kept a respectful distance, finally understanding that blind support of entitlement could backfire spectacularly. I spent my mornings maintaining the hedge, ensuring it was strong, healthy, and visually imposing. This wasn't about intimidation, it was about demonstrating that boundaries exist and that repeated violations would always be met with consequences. As I trimmed and inspected, neighbors waved, whispered words of appreciation, or simply nodded. The hedge had become a symbol of protection, authority, and order, reminding everyone that respect is earned, not demanded. Karen attempted small acts to regain attention, leaving notes for the HOA board or sending passive-aggressive emails to neighbors, but her efforts were weak and transparent. Each attempt fell flat, met with polite indifference or subtle amusement. Her reputation, once a source of fear and control, had diminished. People no longer reacted to her tantrums, instead, they observed and, quietly, learned. One afternoon, a few curious neighbors approached me, asking how I had engineered the trap. I explained carefully, emphasizing safety, legality, and strategy, while leaving out certain critical design details. The key, I told them, wasn't revenge, it was preparation, observation, and decisiveness. Karen had ignored every warning, and the trap simply enforced accountability. Everyone listening seemed to understand that the principle mattered more than the spectacle. The HOA held a meeting shortly after, and the atmosphere had shifted. Discussions that once centered around Karen's complaints were now grounded in property rights, mutual respect, and proper communication. Karen sat silently, glaring, but powerless to dominate the conversation. The board members seemed determined to prevent another situation like hers from arising, having learned that supporting entitlement without responsibility was disastrous. I walked past Karen's house later that week, noticing the wary glance she gave toward my hedge. I smiled quietly to myself. The lesson had been learned, perhaps begrudgingly, but learned nonetheless. My property was protected, my neighbors were safer, and entitlement had been firmly checked. That evening, I sat by the hedge, reflecting on how a simple boundary, reinforced with ingenuity and patience, could restore order in a chaotic situation. Karen had underestimated the consequences, and the neighborhood had learned that respect is not optional. By the following week, life in the neighborhood felt remarkably different. The air of tension that Karen had created over months had dissipated. People walked confidently past my hedge, some pausing to admire its resilience and careful maintenance. It was more than a hedge now, it was a symbol of authority, boundaries, and the consequences of ignoring them. Karen, meanwhile, had withdrawn, rarely leaving her property and avoiding any direct confrontation. I spent time documenting the aftermath of the trap, taking detailed photographs and notes. The goal wasn't to gloat, it was to create a record of safe, legal, and effective action against repeated violations. The trap had been ingenious, but the real victory lay in the lesson it delivered. Every photo, every diagram of the mechanism, was a testament to planning, patience, and careful execution. Should the HOA or Karen attempt any legal action, the documentation made the case airtight. Neighbors occasionally approached, curious or impressed, asking questions about the hedge, the trap, and how I handled the situation. I explained carefully, preparation is key, safety is essential, and consequences must be fair and proportional. The underlying message resonated: entitlement cannot replace responsibility. Karen's behavior, once tolerated or ignored, now served as a cautionary tale for everyone who had observed the drama. One afternoon, the HOA board held another meeting, this time focused on property boundaries and proper conflict resolution. Karen sat quietly, her voice barely audible during discussions. The other members looked to me for guidance, seeking advice on how to enforce rules safely and legally. I emphasized communication, clear documentation, and, if necessary, inventive solutions to